Strike Breaker.
Elvis Blay rubbed his plump hands and said, "Self-containment is the word." He smiled uneasily as he helped Stephen Lamorak of Earth to alight. There was uneasiness all over his smooth face, with its small, wide-set eyes. Lamorak puffed smoke appreciatively and crossed his lanky legs. His hair was powdered with gray, and he had a large and powerful jawbone. "Homegrown?" he asked, staring critically at the cigarette. He tried to hide his own disturbance at the other's tension. "Quite," said Blay. "I wonder," said Lamorak, "that you have room on your small world for such luxuries." Lamorak thought of his first view of Elsevier from the spaceship's visiplate. It was a jagged, airless planetoid, some 100 miles in diameter. Just a dust-gray, rough-hewn rock, glimmering dully in the light of its sun, 200 million miles distant. It was the only object more than a mile in diameter that circled that sun, and now men had burrowed into that miniature world and constructed a society in it. And he himself, as a sociologist, had come to study the world and see how humanity had made itself fit into that queerly specialized niche. Blay's polite, fixed smile expanded a hair. He said, "We are not a small world, Dr. Lamorak. You judge us by two-dimensional standards. The surface area of Elsevier is only 3/4 that of the state of New York, but that's irrelevant. Remember, we can occupy, if we wish, the entire interior of Elsevier. A sphere of 50 miles radius has a volume of well over 500,000 cubic miles. If all of Elsevier were occupied by levels 50 feet apart, the total surface area within the planetoid would be 56 million square miles, and that is equal to the total land area of Earth. And none of these square miles, Doctor, would be unproductive." Lamorak said, "Good Lord," and stared blankly for a moment. "Yes, of course, you're right. Strange I never thought of it that way. But then, Elsevier is the only thoroughly exploited planetoid world in the galaxy. The rest of us simply can't get away from thinking of two-dimensional surfaces, as you pointed out. Well, I'm more than ever glad that your council has been so cooperative as to give me a free hand in this investigation of mine." Blay nodded convulsively at that. Lamorak frowned slightly and thought, "He acts for all the world as though he wished I had not come. Something's wrong." Blay said, "Of course, you understand that we are actually much smaller than we could be. Only minor portions of Elsevier have as yet been hollowed out and occupied, nor are we particularly anxious to expand, except very slowly. To a certain extent, we are limited by the capacity of our pseudo-gravity engines and solar energy converters." "I understand. But tell me, Councillor Blay, as a matter of personal curiosity, and not because it is of prime importance to my project, could I view some of your farming and herding levels first? I'm fascinated by the thought of fields of wheat and herds of cattle inside a planetoid." "You'll find the cattle small by your standards, Doctor, and we don't have much wheat. We grow yeast to a much greater extent, but there will be some wheat to show you, some cotton and tobacco too, even fruit trees." "Wonderful. As you say, self-containment. You recirculate everything, I imagine." Lamorak's sharp eyes did not miss the fact that this last remark twinged Blay. The Elseverian's eyes narrowed to slits that hid his expression. He said, "We must recirculate, yes. Air, water, food, minerals, everything that is used up must be restored to its original state. Waste products are reconverted to raw materials. All that is needed is energy, and we have enough of that. We don't manage with 100% efficiency, of course. There is a certain seepage. We import a small amount of water each year, and if our needs grow, we may have to import some coal and oxygen." Lamorak said, "When can we start our tour, Councillor Blay?" Blay's smile lost some of its negligible warmth. "As soon as we can, Doctor. There are some routine matters that must be arranged." Lamorak nodded, and having finished his cigarette, stubbed it out. Routine matters. There was none of this hesitancy during the preliminary correspondence. Elsevier had seemed proud that its unique planetoid existence had attracted the attention of the galaxy. He said, "I realized I would be a disturbing influence in a tightly knit society," and watched grimly as Blay leaped at the explanation and made it his own. "Yes," said Blay, "we feel marked off from the rest of the galaxy. We have our own customs. Each individual Elseverian fits into a comfortable niche. The appearance of a stranger without fixed caste is unsettling. The caste system does involve a certain inflexibility.
Granted, said Blay quickly, but there is also a certain self-assurance. We have firm rules of intermarriage and rigid inheritance of occupation. Each man, woman, and child knows his place, accepts it, and is accepted in it. We have virtually no neurosis or mental illness.
And are there no misfits? Asked Lamorak. Blay shaped his mouth as though to say no, then clamped it suddenly shut, biting the word into silence. A frown deepened on his forehead. He said at length,
I will arrange for the tour, Doctor. Meanwhile, I imagine you would welcome a chance to freshen up and to sleep.
They rose together and left the room, Blay politely motioning the Earthman to precede him out the door. Lamorak felt oppressed by the vague feeling of crisis that had pervaded his discussion with Blay. The newspaper reinforced that feeling. He read it carefully before getting into bed, with what was at first merely a clinical interest. It was an 8-page tabloid of synthetic paper. 1/4 of its items consisted of personals, births, marriages, deaths, record quotas, expanding habitable volume, not area, 3 dimensions. The remainder included scholarly essays, educational material, and fiction. Of news, in the sense to which Lamorak was accustomed, there was virtually nothing. One item only could be so considered, and that was chilling in its incompleteness. It said, under a small headline, Demands unchanged. There has been no change in his attitude of yesterday. The chief counselor, after a second interview, announced that his demands remain completely unreasonable and cannot be met under any circumstances. Then, in parentheses, and in different type, there was the statement, The editors of this paper agree that Elsevier cannot and will not jump to his whistle come what may. Lamorak read it over 3 times. His attitude, his demands, his whistle. Whose? He slept uneasily that night. He had no time for newspapers in the days that followed, but spasmodically the matter returned to his thoughts. Blay, who remained his guide and companion for most of the tour, grew ever more withdrawn. On the 3rd day, quite artificially clock-set in an Earth-like 24-hour pattern, Blay stopped at one point and said,
Now, this level is devoted entirely to chemical industries. That section is not important.
But he turned away a shade too rapidly, and Lamorak seized his arm. What are the products of that section?
Fertilizers, certain organics, said Blay stiffly.
Lamorak held him back, looking for what sight Blay might be evading. His gaze swept over the close-by horizons of lined rock, and the buildings squeezed and layered between the levels. Lamorak said, Isn't that a private residence there? Blay did not look in the indicated direction. Lamorak said, I think that's the largest one I've seen yet. Why is it here on a factory level? That alone made it noteworthy. He had already seen that the levels on Elsevier were divided rigidly among the residential, the agricultural, and the industrial. He looked back and called, Councillor Blay! The councillor was walking away, and Lamorak pursued him with hasty steps. Is there something wrong, sir?
Blay muttered, I am rude, I know. I am sorry. There are matters that prey on my mind.
He kept up his rapid pace. Concerning his demands? Blay came to a full halt.
What do you know about that?
No more than I've said. I read that much in the newspaper. Blay muttered something to himself. Lamorak said, Raguznik? What's that? Blay sighed heavily.
I suppose you ought to be told. It's humiliating, deeply embarrassing. The council thought that matters would certainly be arranged shortly, and that your visit need not be interfered with, that you need not know or be concerned. But it is almost a week now. I don't know what will happen, and appearances notwithstanding, it might be best for you to leave. No reason for an outworlder to risk death.
The Earthman smiled incredulously. Risk death? In this little world so peaceful and busy? I can't believe it. The Elseverian councillor said,
I can explain. I think it best I should.
He turned his head away.
As I told you, everything on Elsevier must recirculate. You understand that?
Yes.
That includes, human wastes.
I assumed so, said Lamorak.
Water is reclaimed from it by distillation and absorption. What remains is converted into fertilizer for yeast use. Some of it is used as a source of fine organics and other byproducts. These factories, you see, are devoted to this.
Well? Lamorak had experienced a certain difficulty in the drinking of water when he first landed on Elsevier, because he had been realistic enough to know what it must be reclaimed from. But he had conquered the feeling easily enough. Even on Earth, water was reclaimed by natural processes from all sorts of unpalatable substances. Blay, with increasing difficulty, said, Igor Raguznik is the man who is in charge of the industrial processes immediately involving the wastes. The position has been in his family since Elsevier was first colonized. One of the original settlers was Mikhail Raguznik, and he was in charge of waste reclamation?
Yes. Now that residence you singled out is the Raguznik residence. It is the best and most elaborate on the planetoid. Raguznik gets many privileges the rest of us do not have. But, after all...
Passion entered the counselor's voice with great suddenness.
We cannot speak to him.
What?
He demands full social equality. He wants his children to mingle with ours, and our wives to visit... Oh!
It was a groan of utter disgust. Lamorak thought of the newspaper item that could not even bring itself to mention Raguznik's name in print, or to say anything specific about his demands. He said, I take it he's an outcast because of his job.
Naturally. Human wastes and...
Words failed Blay. After a pause, he said more quietly,
As an Earthman, I suppose you don't understand.
As a sociologist, I think I do. Lamorak thought of the untouchables in ancient India, the ones who handled corpses. He thought of the position of swineherds in ancient Judea. He went on, I gather Elsevier will not give in to those demands.
Never, said Blay energetically. Never.
And so?
Raguznik has threatened to cease operations.
Go on strike, in other words?
Yes.
Would that be serious?
We have enough food and water to last quite a while. Reclamation is not essential in that sense. But the wastes would accumulate. They would infect the planetoid. After generations of careful disease control, we have low natural resistance to germ diseases. Once an epidemic started, and one would, we would drop by the 100.
Is Raguznik aware of this?
Yes, of course.
Do you think he's likely to go through with his threat, then?
He is mad. He has already stopped working. There has been no waste reclamation since the day before you landed.
Blay's bulbous nose sniffed at the air, as though it already caught the whiff of excrement. Lamorak sniffed mechanically at that, but smelled nothing. Blay said,
So you see why it might be wise for you to leave. We are humiliated, of course, to have to suggest it.
But Lamorak said, Wait, not just yet. Good Lord, this is a matter of great interest to me professionally. May I speak to the Raguznik?
On no account,
said Blay, alarmed. But I would like to understand the situation. The sociological conditions here are unique and not to be duplicated elsewhere. In the name of science.
How do you mean, speak? Would image reception do?
Yes?
I will ask the council, muttered Blay.
They sat about Lamorak uneasily, their austere and dignified expressions badly marred with anxiety. Blay, seated in the midst of them, studiously avoided the Earthman's eyes. The chief counselor, gray-haired, his face harshly wrinkled, his neck scrawny, said in a soft voice, If in any way you can persuade him, sir, out of your own convictions, we will welcome that. In no case, however, are you to imply that we will in any way yield. A gauzy curtain fell between the council and Lamorak. He could make out the individual councillors still, but now he turned sharply toward the receiver before him. It glowed to life. A head appeared in it, in natural color and with great realism. A strong, dark head, with massive chin faintly stubbled and thick red lips set into a firm horizontal line. The image said suspiciously, Who are you? Lamorak said, My name is Stephen Lamorak. I am an Earthman. An outworlder? That's right. I am visiting Elsevier. You are Raguznik? Igor Raguznik at your service, said the image mockingly. Except that there is no service, and will be none until my family and I are treated like human beings. Lamorak said, Do you realize the danger that Elsevier is in? The possibility of epidemic disease? In 24 hours, the situation can be made normal. If they allow me humanity, the situation is theirs to correct. You sound like an educated man, Raguznik. So? I am told you're denied of no material comforts. You are housed and clothed and fed better than anyone on Elsevier. Your children are the best educated. Granted, but all by servo mechanism. And motherless girl babies are sent to us to care for until they grow to be our wives. And they die young for loneliness. Why? There was sudden passion in his voice. Why must we live in isolation as if we were all monsters, unfit for human beings to be near? Aren't we human beings like others with the same needs and desires and feelings? Don't we perform an honorable and useful function? There was a rustling of sighs from behind Lamorak. Raguznik heard it and raised his voice. I see you of the council behind there. Answer me. Isn't it an honorable and useful function? It is your waste made into food for you. Is the man who purifies corruption worse than the man who produces it? Listen, councillors, I will not give in. Let all of Elsevier die of disease, including myself and my son, if necessary. But I will not give in. My family will be better dead of disease than living as now. Lamorak interrupted. You've led this life since birth, haven't you? And if I have, surely you're used to it. Never. Resigned, perhaps. My father was resigned, and I was resigned for a while. But I have watched my son, my only son, with no other little boy to play with. My brother and I had each other, but my son will never have anyone. And I am no longer resigned. I am through with Elsevier and through with talking. The receiver went dead. The chief counselor's face had paled to an aged yellow. He and Blay were the only ones of the group left with Lamorak. The chief counselor said, The man is deranged. I do not know how to force him. He had a glass of wine at his side. As he lifted it to his lips, he spilled a few drops that stained his white trousers with purple splotches. Lamorak said, Are his demands so unreasonable? Why can't he be accepted into society? There was momentary rage in Blay's eyes. A dealer in excrement? Then he shrugged. You are from Earth. Incongruously, Lamorak thought of another unacceptable, one of the numerous classic creations of the medieval cartoonist Al Cap, the variously named Inside Man at the Skunk Works. He said, Does Raguznik really deal with excrement? I mean, is there physical contact? Surely it is all handled by automatic machinery. Of course, said the chief counselor. Then exactly what is Raguznik's function? He manually adjusts the various controls that assure the proper functioning of the machinery. He shifts units to allow repairs to be made. He alters functional rates with the time of day. He varies end production with the demand. He added sadly, If we had the space to make the machinery 10 times as complex, all this could be done automatically. But that would be such needless waste. But even so, insisted Lamorak, all Raguznik does, he does simply by pressing buttons or closing contacts or things like that. Yes. Then his work is no different from any Elseverian's. Blay said stiffly, You don't understand. And for that you will risk the death of your children? We have no other choice, said Blay. There was enough agony in his voice to assure Lamorak that the situation was torture for him, but that he had no other choice indeed. Lamorak shrugged in disgust. Then break the strike. Force him. How? Said the chief counselor. Who would touch him or go near him? And if we kill him by blasting from a distance, how will that help us? Lamorak said thoughtfully, Would you know how to run his machinery? The chief counselor came to his feet. I? He howled. I don't mean you, cried Lamorak at once. I use the pronoun in its indefinite sense. Could someone learn how to handle Raguznik's machinery? Slowly the passion drained out of the chief counselor. It is in the handbooks, I am certain, though I assure you I have never concerned myself with it. Then couldn't someone learn the procedure and substitute for Raguznik until the man gives in? Blay said, Who would agree to such a thing? Not I under any circumstances. Lamorak thought fleetingly of earthly taboos that might be almost as strong. He thought of cannibalism, incest, a pious man cursing God. He said, But you must have made provision for a vacancy in the Raguznik job? Suppose he died. Then his son would automatically succeed to his job, or his nearest other relative, said Blay. What if he had no adult relatives? What if all his family died at once?
That has never happened. It will never happen.
The chief counselor added, "If there were danger of it, we might perhaps place a baby or two with the Raguzniks and have it raised to the profession." "Ah, and how would you choose that baby?" "From among the children of mothers who died in childbirth, as we choose the future Raguznik bride." "Then choose a substitute Raguznik now, by lot," said Lamorak. The chief counselor said, "No, impossible. How can you suggest that? If we select a baby, that baby is brought up to the life. It knows no other. At this point, it would be necessary to choose an adult and subject him to Raguznikhood. No, Dr. Lamorak, we are neither monsters nor abandoned brutes." No use, thought Lamorak helplessly. No use, unless... He couldn't bring himself to face that unless just yet. That night, Lamorak slept scarcely at all. Raguznik asked for only the basic elements of humanity. But opposing that were 30,000 Elseverians who faced death. The welfare of 30,000 on one side, the just demands of one family on the other. Could one say that 30,000 who would support such injustice deserved to die? Injustice by what standards? Earth's? Elsevier's? And who was Lamorak that he should judge? And Raguznik. He was willing to let 30,000 die, including men and women who merely accepted a situation they had been taught to accept and could not change if they wished to, and children who had nothing at all to do with it. 30,000 on one side, a single family on the other. Lamorak made his decision in something that was almost despair. In the morning, he called the chief counselor. He said, "Sir, if you can find a substitute, Raguznik will see that he has lost all chance to force a decision in his favor and will return to work." "There can be no substitute," sighed the chief counselor. "I have explained that." "No substitute among the Elseverians, but I am not an Elseverian. It doesn't matter to me. I will substitute." They were excited, much more excited than Lamorak himself. A dozen times they asked him if he was serious. Lamorak had not shaved, and he felt sick. "Certainly I'm serious. And any time Raguznik acts like this, you can always import a substitute. No other world has the taboo, and there will always be plenty of temporary substitutes available if you pay enough." He was betraying a brutally exploited man, and he knew it. But he told himself desperately, except for ostracism, he's very well treated, very well. They gave him the handbooks, and he spent 6 hours reading and rereading. There was no use asking questions. None of the Elseverians knew anything about the job, except for what was in the handbook, and all seemed uncomfortable if the details were as much as mentioned. "Maintain 0 reading of galvanometer, A2 at all times during red signal of the lunge howler," read Lamorak. "Now, what's a lunge howler?" "There will be a sign," muttered Blay, and the Elseverians looked at each other hangdog and bent their heads to stare at their finger ends. They left him long before he reached the small rooms that were the central headquarters of generations of working Raguzniks serving their world. He had specific instructions concerning which turnings to take and what level to reach, but they hung back and let him proceed alone. He went through the rooms painstakingly, identifying the instruments and controls, following the schematic diagrams in the handbook. "There's a lunge howler," he thought, with gloomy satisfaction. The sign did indeed say so. It had a semicircular face bitten into holes that were obviously designed to glow in separate colors. Why a howler, then? He didn't know. Somewhere, thought Lamorak, somewhere wastes are accumulating, pushing against gears and exits, pipelines and stills, waiting to be handled in 100 ways. Now they just accumulate. Not without a tremor, he pulled the first switch, as indicated by the handbook, in its directions for initiation. A gentle murmur of life made itself felt through the floors and walls. He turned a knob, and lights went on. At each step, he consulted the handbook, though he knew it by heart, and with each step, the rooms brightened and the dial indicators sprang into motion, and a humming grew louder. Somewhere deep in the factories, the accumulated wastes were being drawn into the proper channels. A high-pitched signal sounded and startled Lamorak out of his painful concentration. It was the communication signal, and Lamorak fumbled his receiver into action. Raguznik's head showed, startled. Then, slowly, the incredulity and outright shock faded from his eyes. "That's how it is, then." "I'm not an Elseverian, Raguznik. I don't mind doing this."
But what business is it of yours? Why do you interfere?
I'm on your side, Raguznik, but I must do this.
Why, if you're on my side? Do they treat people on your world as they treat me here?
Not any longer. But even if you were right, there are 30,000 people on Elsevier to be considered.
They would have given in. You've ruined my only chance.
They would not have given in. And in a way, you've won. They know now that you're dissatisfied. Until now, they never dreamed a Raguznik could be unhappy, that he could make trouble.
What if they know? Now all they need do is hire an outworlder any time.
Lamorak shook his head violently. He had thought this through in these last bitter hours. The fact that they know means that the Elseverians will begin to think about you. Some will begin to wonder if it's right to treat a human so. And if outworlders are hired, they'll spread the word that this goes on upon Elsevier, and galactic public opinion will be in your favor. And things will improve. In your son's time, things will be much better.
In my son's time, said Raguznik, his cheeks sagging. I might have had it now. Well, I lose. I'll go back to the job.
Lamorak felt an overwhelming relief. If you'll come here now, sir, you may have your job, and I'll consider it an honor to shake your hand. Raguznik's head snapped up and filled with a gloomy pride.
You call me sir and offer to shake my hand. Go about your business, Earthman, and leave me to my work, for I would not shake yours.
Lamorak returned the way he had come, relieved that the crisis was over, and profoundly depressed, too. He stopped in surprise when he found a section of corridor cordoned off, so he should not pass. He looked about for alternate routes, then startled at a magnified voice above his head.
Dr. Lamorak, do you hear me? This is Counselor Blay.
Lamorak looked up. The voice came over some sort of public address system, but he saw no sign of an outlet. He called out, "Is anything wrong? Can you hear me?"
I hear you.
Instinctively, Lamorak was shouting,
"Is anything wrong? There seems to be a block here. Are there complications with Raguznik?"
"Raguznik has gone to work," came Blay's voice. "The crisis is over, and you must make ready to leave."
Leave?
Leave Elsevier. A ship is being made ready for you now.
But wait a bit.
Lamorak was confused by this sudden leap of events.
I haven't completed my gathering of data.
Blay's voice said, "This cannot be helped. You will be directed to the ship, and your belongings will be sent after you by servo mechanisms. We trust. Something was becoming clear to Lamorak.
You trust what?
We trust you will make no attempt to see or speak directly to any Elseverian. And of course we hope you will avoid embarrassment by not attempting to return to Elsevier at any time in the future. A colleague of yours would be welcome if further data concerning us is needed."
"I understand,"
said Lamorak tonelessly. Obviously, he himself had become a Raguznik. He had handled the controls that in turn had handled the wastes. He was ostracized. He was a corpse handler, a swineherd, an inside man at the skunk works. He said, "Goodbye." Blay's voice said, "Before we direct you, Dr. Lamorak, on behalf of the Council of Elsevier, I thank you for your help in this crisis."
"You're welcome," said Lamorak, bitterly. Sitting around the pool, soaking up the rays. By Frederick Pohl. I had no way of telling how well the conference was going. None of us did. We didn't understand much of what was being said. And anyway, we didn't really know what the issues were in the first place. So the way I tried to judge it was by the amount of yelling. There had been a lot. My head hurt. From that, and from not being allowed even a drink of water for 3.5 straight hours. And from a lot of other things, too. So I came out of the Lilio-Kalani ballroom feeling poorly and looking worse, lifting each foot in turn in that circular howdy-doody prance my boss favors, and the Maui sun hit me right in the face. I blinked, I stumbled, and all of a sudden the boss whispered, "Later," and left me on my own. That's the way it always was. Take over without warning, and without warning, take off. So I had some slack time. The first thing I did, of course, was pee. You do that when you can, whenever you get a chance. You learn that right away. Then I headed for the pool. Mark Sokol was coming toward me.
If I have a real friend among the bunch at the Makayley Motel, male friend anyway, Mark is it. But he went by me without a word, slithering along like a mime doing serpents. There was no point in talking to him, and I didn't try. It was hot in the sun. There were 140 of us at the motel, but you'd never know it from the skimpy showing around the pool. When we're not working, we tend to run and hide somewhere, at least during the first few weeks. The Makayley Motel is built on the side of a hill in the shape of a U, with big staggered rooms going down toward the ocean, and the wings of the building surrounding the palm trees and the pool and the sun deck and the winding carp stream and the kerosene flares they still light up with torches every sundown, beating out time on a drum as the beach boys race from flare to flare. Pretty much it's the way it was in civilian days, when tourists paid $160 a day for the rooms and lanais and more than that in the bar. Doesn't cost us a thing, especially the bar doesn't, since they closed it down. I was hoping to find Lois around the pool, but she was probably busy, or at least absent, so I sat down on a beach chair and threw my terry cloth robe off to catch some sun. The one thing I definitely expected to gain out of this was a tan. Alice leaned over in a predatory way and said, "How about it, Ben? You want to play some bridge?" Alice is a nice enough old lady, but she's over 70, and she didn't really look good in a deep-cut one-piece bathing suit. She is also someone I don't particularly want to play cards with. She's a professional card hustler, or was, took her retirement from the math department at Georgia Tech and went out to beat the blackjack dealers in Vegas. She did it very well, too, until she got recruited. So I turned her down, as she expected I would. She settled for backgammon with sad, sorry little Elsa McKee, our newest and unhappiest recruit. A shadow fell over me from behind. I jumped up and turned around and yelled, "Don't do that!" It wasn't anyone to worry about. It was just Arnold, who is one of our doctors. All he wanted was to check me out, but he should have known better than to startle me. "Sorry," he said. He probably was. "Just hold still." He stethoscoped me and pulsed me and pulled down one eyelid to look at the broken veins. "How are you feeling, Ben?" he asked. "Hungry," I said at random, and he nodded and snapped his fingers for a poolside waiter and told me I was all right. Shows how much he knows. Arnold doesn't really like us much. Neither do the waiters or the maids or the guards. When you come right down to it, I wouldn't even say we like ourselves a whole bunch. But of course, they're afraid to let anything go wrong with us. When the waiter rushed up to offer me the menu, the poor son of a bitch was trembling. The menu was about a yard tall and printed on what felt like plush. I tried to hold it so the sun glare didn't make me squint while I studied every item. It all looked very good. The thing I've noticed about my life is that I almost always get everything I want, but only when I either can't take advantage of it or don't want it anymore. This was a case of Category A. Before I was recruited, I was a tech manual compiler for an electronics company in Redondo Beach. $22,000 a year when I was working, which wasn't always, and a $90,000 mortgage to pay off. A big Saturday night date for me was Alaskan king crab's legs at the nearest Red Lobster Inn. And here the beach boy was handing me Mr. Lucullus's personal menu, pressed duck and mahi-mahi and chateaubriand, and all of it free. Free! We live like kings, we servants of the stars. Only I didn't know if I'd get a chance to eat it if I ordered it. So I asked what was ready right that minute. "Roast beef, mashed potatoes, salad," he said, without looking at me in the eye, afraid of what he might see. He was prepared to go on, but I said that would do, with a lot of fresh orange juice. The doctor looked up from tapping Elsa's sweet, skinny little knee and nodded approval. Arnold is always after us about vitamins. He convinced me he was right when Jack Marcantonio fell over right in the middle of a screaming session with another delegate in the sandalwood room. They had to take him away. Arnold told us later that he had been DOA at the hospital. Jack had been getting most of his calories from bourbon, and right after that they closed the Whaler bar. I dialed Lois's room on the poolside phone. No answer, so I leaned back to work on my tan, sort of hoping I would fall asleep. But across the pool, Walter and Felice were keeping me awake. And not Walter, Felice. They were stretched out on canvas mats, face down, lips almost touching, and Felice had a blue bikini on. Whenever I looked, I saw her bottom, and it kept me looking up every minute to see if Lois was coming, so we could take a quick dip in the pool and then go up to one of our rooms and forget what we were doing with our lives.
One of the soldiers from the machine gun nest was staring at Felice, too. When he looked away and caught my eye, he glared at me, as though he were jealous of us pampered proxies. Jealous of us? He was a new man. By the end of the week, he wouldn't be jealous any more, if he lasted that long. He wasn't supposed to be looking our way. He was supposed to be guarding us against any evil-intentioned Earth patriots or guerrillas who might be trying to sneak in to interrupt our deliberations. And if the lieutenant caught him gazing at the girls, he would have been in trouble of his own. The funny thing was that the machine gunner wasn't looking at Elsa, who was a lot closer, and just about as naked. I guess a weeping woman was not the right kind of sex object. "Pay attention to your game," Alice scolded. But Elsa was not capable of that. You couldn't blame her. She had been on her honeymoon when she was recruited, and they wouldn't let her new husband come with her. Elsa is short, slim, pretty, very, very young. Her hair is short, too, muddy brown streaked with gold, and it flops around her head when she moves. I would bet that represented a $75 investment at the beauty parlor to get ready for the wedding, and now it was wasted on us. "Hell with it," said Alice, tipping the backgammon board so all the pieces slid to the end, and turning to me. "Ben, do you know what you were talking about today?" "The same thing. Minerals, radionuclides mostly. They're apeshit for that radioactive stuff." She nodded as though it meant something to her. Perhaps it did, but not to me. In those wheeling and dealing sessions, I understand only part of what is being said, even when it comes out of my own mouth. What do I know about curium or americium or carbon-14? This may be just as well. Sometimes I think the Earth patriots have the right idea. And if I really knew what the deals in the Liliuokalani ballroom were about, I would be grabbing a gun and trying to storm the Makayley Motel myself. If the boss let me, of course. Which, of course, he wouldn't. Elsa had stopped sobbing long enough to gaze mistily at the lobby door. "What's that?" she asked, the object of her question being 5 dilapidated people in clothes meant for Boston or Chicago, gaping apprehensively at the pool and the armed guards. The assistant manager of the motel was trying to soothe them, but not succeeding. "Congratulations, Elsa," I said. "You're now a senior member. That's what we all looked like when we got here. There's a new generation of recruits." It would have been an act of kindness to go up to them and welcome them and try to make them feel less trapped and hopeless. But why should I lie to them? Anyway, my lunch was arriving. Anyway, there were 2 members of our happy family walking toward them already, except that their errand was not welcoming. They were occupied. They were walking along together, clutching each other's hands and shouting in each other's ears. Alice scowled because they were making so much noise, and the waiter, coming toward me with my dinner, switched and took the long way around to avoid them. Their names were Greg and Julio. I said they were walking, but actually Greg was bouncy hopping like Peter Cottontail, and Julio was slinking like a 2-legged cat, or like Groucho Marx. They were heading directly for one of those palm trees that looks like a green fright wig growing out of the top of an artichoke, and as they were not looking where they were going, Julio plowed right into it, head on, still talking. And he kept right on talking, while Greg jerked him back onto his feet, and they walked on, although Julio was beginning to bleed fairly heavily around the cheekbone. The new arrivals scattered despairingly and then disappeared back in the lobby. But I had my lunch to attend to. The orange juice was fresh and fine. The roast beef was good, too, although as the pool waiter was serving it, Alice suddenly jumped up, kicked over the backgammon board, and left for one of the motel's meeting rooms at a dead run, arms and legs windmilling wildly. The waiter dodged out of the way, his face blanching. Elsa gaped after her, and then lifted her face and howled, big tears sliding down her face. Then Elsa stood and ran in the opposite direction, back to her room. But there was nothing queer about her gait. It was Elsa doing it herself, just scared, sick, and despairing. And there I was, all alone by the $1 million pool, eating my $50 meal outside my $200-a-day hotel room, and wondering if, after all, there was really anything wrong with suicide. It was a thought that had crossed my mind before. It had occurred to me, in fact, about every other minute since that minute when I turned off the 11 o'clock news, got into my pajamas, brushed my teeth in front of the bathroom mirror, and then, in an instant, saw that something else was looking out of my sleepy eyes. It was something I neither recognized nor knew what to do about, but I didn't have any choice. What I did for the next little while was not my own doing. I dialed an 800 number I hadn't known I knew, I put a coat on over the pajamas and waited about 5 minutes, not more, until a Long Beach ambulance pulled up at my door and a jittery driver took me to a helicopter pad, then to LAX, then by jet to Hawaii, then here. I left a whole life back in Orange County. 3 girls I was dating, folk dancing every Thursday night, car payments, mortgage, an unfinished manual on a new pocket calculator, and the Sunday crossword puzzle left undone. I didn't even get a chance to say goodbye, so my thoughts are often gloomy. But the brightener is Lois. I was fiddling with the last of the roast beef when I heard her call my name. I jumped up and she ran into my arms. Lois is not anything like any of the 3 women back in Orange County. I don't think I would have dated her there, not so much because she is black as because she is skinny, at least 10 years older than me, and not really all that pretty. But here on beautiful Maui, she has one big thing going for her. That was that when we made love, after we made love, she was the one to whom I could hold tight while we admitted to each other how bad we really felt. "Are you hungry?" I asked her. She gave me the answer just by the way she looked up at me, grinning, and I said, "Your place or mine?" I didn't have to ask that. I knew the answer. The answer was the nearest. With my free hand, I grabbed a couple of rolls for Lois in case she really was hungry, and we started off, arms around each other's waists. And then the boss whispered, "Now." That was that. I dropped the rolls. I stepped on them as I turned. I felt my knuckles bounce off Lois's elbow when she didn't get out of the way fast enough. But I didn't look at her. I was looking where I was heading in that fast and spastic marionette hustle all the way to the Liliuokalani ballroom. There's a book about a little boy named Curdy. I read it as a little kid. Curdy spent his time in the deep mines in, I guess, Germany or somewhere, being chased by weird-looking kobolds and gnomes and creepy, awful creatures of all kinds. The book scared me into 5-year-old nightmares. I did not at that time think I would ever be one of the gnomes. But that is what we all were, crawly and spastic, berserk or just bizarre. We moved the way our bosses moved. We writhed and wriggled, and we hissed at each other or screamed. I looked at my colleagues in the ballroom or the meeting rooms when we were settling shipment priorities or whatever it was we were doing. They were awful. So was I. I cannot tell you how grossly violated this makes you feel when some far-off boss takes over your body your mother lovingly hatched for you, and the mind you've filled with 1,000,000 memories, and the mouth you have used to speak your heart. It isn't your heart that's speaking now. It's someone else's, or something else's, and most likely it's something that doesn't even have a heart back where it comes from, but turns out to be a cluster of heavy metal polyps on the slushy bottom of an ammonia sea, or a halogen jelly in some poison swamp. The other night, while Lois was having her once-a-day hysterics, she whimpered that it was like being raped by the 5th Armored Division, tanks and all. It isn't, though. It's worse. I suppose that in its time, the Liliuokalani ballroom has had its share of weddings and corporate planning sessions and bar mitzvahs, or whatever they have on Maui that's like a bar mitzvah, and I bet every one of them was more fun than the bargaining sessions. You'd see the hotel people sneaking around, trying not to attract attention while they dusted off the tables and picked up the trash, and the worse than trash, because the sessions went on non-stop, all day, every day. It was about 3 in the afternoon when I bounced back into the bargaining session, but it would have been the same at midnight. I plunged right into the bargaining. That's how the boss does it. There aren't any introductions, just all of a sudden you're battling over which planet gets the next shipment of high-level military wastes, or who's willing to give up a load of spent fuel from a nuclear generating station if he can have the right to trawl the Atlantic Sea bottom for old ocean-dumped canisters, as if any of it was theirs to begin with. They say taking away all these dangerous radioactive wastes is actually a kindness to us on their part, because we've been worrying so much about how to deal with them. Their plan is simple. They ship them all to Borneo. Why Borneo? Because Borneo is on the equator, and that's where they're building their launch catapult, which will throw the cargoes into low Earth orbit, whereupon they will be packed into photon sail ships. And sooner or later, they will get to where one of the spacies wants them. When they talk to the human race in one of their occasional public statements, they're always pointing out that this is really awfully sweet of them. We don't have much they want, they say. The launch system they're building is very expensive, though the Earth governments are paying for it. The only reason they're doing it in the first place, they tell us, is that they just want to give us a hand, to speed up our intellectual and technological advancement so we can be as good as they are. Maybe so. They're not in any hurry about it, though. Some of those cargoes aren't going to get there for 1,000 years, because photon-sail ships aren't very fast. They don't care. They have plenty of time. And they tell us that by the time the cargoes start arriving, we pitiful human beings will be educated up to their standard. And then we can join the Galactic Club. Oh, frabjous day. Oh, time of great joy for the world. Then the trade will be two-way. Then they'll send us just shiploads and shiploads of the most marvelous and technologically advanced gadgets. I imagine that's what Captain Bligh told the Tahitians when he swiped their breadfruit. On the other hand, so my friend Mark says, you have to admit the Spaceys did us a kind of favor at that. The old Earth was really scaring itself to death. 50,000 nuclear warheads pointed at 50,000 others, and all of them on a short fuse. There was a three-way summit conference going on in Geneva when the first Spaceys began grabbing off human beings to be their slaves. It wasn't going well either, and I think every one of us breathed a sigh of relief when the Americans and Russians and Chinese issued a joint communique, the first they'd ever agreed on, to say that in view of the extraordinary circumstances, meaning the Spaceys, they were going to recess the meetings without prejudice, meaning they would take their fingers off the triggers, at least for a minute. So I guess in a way we poor puppets are a big help to the human race. Our own governments tell us we are. They say we are VIPs squared, although you don't feel very important when you're in one of those meetings and see yourself trying to emphasize a point by shaking or waving and uncoiling a member you don't have, although you'd be surprised how close you can come. But they say we do big work. They say that because the travel times are so long, there's no way at all for these starborn creatures to come in person to our miserable little out-of-the-way planet. So if we want poor primitive Earth to play any part at all in the great galactic congeries of cultures, they have to do it the only way they can. Telepathically. Not exactly telepathically, but by thought beefed up by some sort of amplifying technology that lets them reach out millions of times faster than light into the minds of such handy appliances as Lois and Elsa and me, so that we can be their eyes and arms and voices. The word is possessed. There really are demons, only they come from places like Halt and Alpha Centauri, and they don't want our souls. All they want is our radionuclides, and the frail and frantic bodies of people like me to puppet, so they can squawk and scream at each other as they confer to divide up the loot. So they say we matter, we miserable puppets on Hawaii's Golden Island. They say we're so terribly important that all the resources of the civilized world are at our disposal to protect us. We've never asked for them, though. They surround us with machine guns and patrol the air overhead with F-15s and Foxbats so that no wild-eyed Earth patriot can break in to interrupt our galactic deliberations. Big deal. Oh, biggest of all deals ever. I do not deserve such an honor. I've got my faults, but that wicked I have never been. And that's the way it was with us. Until, suddenly, one morning, it wasn't. I'd had a really good night's sleep, the first in ages. I woke ravenous and rested. Fruit and rolls and orange juice in a bowl of ice and hot coffee in a thermos were set out on the lanai, the way they were every morning, and I stretched and yawned and gloried to myself in the fact that I'd been left alone for, what was it? Had to be 10 hours or more. Hot sun beat down on me as I swallowed the juice and poured the coffee. There was an unusual number of us poor captives down in the gardens. I saw Alice standing by the carpool, just as she caught sight of me up on the lanai. "Come down," she called. "Hurry up, come on, Ben, now." I was feeling too good to be playing cards. "I'm not interested in playing bridge right now," I called back, surveying the people on the chance that Lois, too, had time off. And Alice cackled, "Bridge? Who said anything about bridge? Wake up and smell the coffee cooking, you idiot. Don't you know they've gone?" Well, they weren't really gone, of course, because in any tangible physical sense, they'd never been there. But what Alice meant was unbelievably true. The insides of all our heads were vacated by the squatters. Our bodies had been returned to us. The endless, squawking, bickering conferences to split up the spoils of Earth were permanently adjourned. Not just in Hawaii, not just for the moment, but all over the Earth, and lastingly. Left us stranded and confused. Oh, glad about it, sure. But none of us had expected so instant a reprieve. Neither us unlucky subjects, nor our masters who owned the machine guns. 90 minutes after the last straggle of alien-run humans abandoned their cawing and screeching at each other in the Liliuokalani room, the 5 power commandants were there, arguing about what to do with us. Let us go home? Oh, hell no. Not a chance. The Spaceys might come back. No, sir. We guests would just have to go on being guests until somebody could figure out just what was going on, whenever that might be. If the 5 military commandants were confused, it was because their governments were even more confused than they were. There had been no warning at all. The Spaceys just left. The possessed engineers at the launch facility in Borneo were as abandoned as we. We Islands of the Pacific wasn't really all that bad, once we began to believe we were going to be allowed to finish a kiss we started, or be there to eat an ordered meal. You could say it was pretty neat, in fact. We swam in the surf or the pool. A lot of was trying to figure out what to do about us. See, we'd never met until we were both drafted, without consent or option. And while we had come to treasure each other very much, second, Lois conceded that neither really did color. Where we were hung up mostly was on the fact that she didn't want to live in Orange County, and I didn't. The only arbitration available was our mutual friend, Mark Sokol. We found him in the Whaler Bar, drinking Mai Tais and smoking to fly in, and a quiet end, where the TV set was on with the picture bright but the sound down, showing sharpened pencils. We caught him in the throes of literary composition. When he looked up, sucking on the "What's the matter?" And when we told him what was the matter, he scoffed. "Job? Well, I was a prisoner of the star creatures. Only you can't use that title because it's mine." "Exactly. That's why you want to get in first." Last night I sneaked over to the airport, putting down his drink and picking up his cigar. "We've got to have some ground rules. Your particular boss was like." "I don't know if I want to think about that," said Lois. "Interpretive part," I asked. "When you explain what you think the Spaceys were really doing, the guesses from, if not from us, that's where we have to be careful. I'll tell you, I'm disappointed. What they really want is radioactive materials." She was looking past him and over his head at the silent TV screen. They were pulling up and disgorging their occupants. "I don't remember I guess you were right, Mark," I said, staring at the screen. "I got in a terribly familiar bunny jump way. The Chinese, to satisfy any demand at all."